When you picture a frontier cabin surviving a deadly winter, you think about the fire. A big stove, a deep woodpile, enough fuel to keep the iron glowing until spring. That is what every settler on the Great Plains believed. More wood, hotter fire, longer burn. But the fire was never the problem. The problem was the walls. Every log seam, every chinking gap, every poorly notched joint was a road for the wind to walk through and carry the heat away. You could burn 10 cords and still freeze if the cabin gave the warmth back faster than the stove could make it. One man understood this, not because he was a builder, but because he had once pressed his hand against a wall that the wind could not enter. Orrin Vale had not planned to die in Nebraska. He had not planned much of anything past the next freight season, which was how a man ended up 49 years old with 160 acres of government dirt, a partner's fresh grave, and a boy who was not his own coughing through the walls of a cabin that was not yet a cabin. The claim sat 3 miles south of Frenchman Creek, in a cluster the settlers called Holland Bend, though no one had bothered to file that name with any post office. 16 homestead claims fanned out across the bottomland. 6 families had raised cottonwood cabins. One man, Lucian Broadwick, had built a store with a plank floor and a sign that read "General Merchandise" in letters he had painted himself, crooked at the M. The nearest rail siding was 21 miles east at Benkelman. The nearest doctor was 34 miles beyond that. And Orrin Vale's cabin had 3 walls, half a roof, and a dead man's promise holding the whole thing upright. Wade Rusk had been the one with the plan. Wade had read the Homestead Act circular in a Platte River saloon and decided that 160 acres of free land was worth 5 years of proving up. He had talked Orrin into partnering because Orrin knew how to winter on the plains, and Wade knew how to file paper. They had staked the claim in April of 1887, cut cottonwood from the creek bottom through May and June, and raised walls through July. By August, the cabin was 16 feet by 20 feet, roofed on the south half, open on the north where the ridge pole needed one more beam. Then Wade went to haul the last cottonwood poles from a stand 4 miles upstream. The wagon tongue cracked on a dry wash crossing. The load shifted. Wade went under the wheels and broke something inside his chest that no one at Holland Bend knew how to name. He lived 9 days. On the 7th, he made Orrin swear to keep the claim and keep Merritt. Merritt was Wade's nephew, 10 years old, thin-armed and serious, with a cough that had started on the freight road from Kearney and had not stopped since. Wade had taken the boy after Merritt's mother died of typhoid in Omaha, and now Wade was dead, and the boy belonged to a man who had spent 30 years sleeping in dugouts and line camps and had never once been responsible for a child. Orrin buried Wade on a Tuesday in September, in ground already hardening toward autumn. He owned 1 lamed mule with a cracked hoof, 200 pounds of cornmeal in a canvas sack, 1 cast-iron stove that Wade had freighted from Benkelman at a cost of $11, a set of trapping tools he no longer used, and $9.80 in coin. He owed Lucian Broadwick $31.70 for flour, axle grease, stovepipe, and nails, a debt Wade had signed for and Orrin had inherited along with everything else. He could not leave. Abandoning the claim forfeited the land, and forfeiting the land left Merritt with nothing, no shelter, no legal ground, no adult within 34 miles who had any obligation to feed him. The boy had no other relatives that Orrin knew of. Walking away meant handing Merritt to strangers or to the road, and Orrin had lived on the road long enough to know what it did to children. So he stayed. And within a week of the burial, Ephraim Bell came to tell him why staying was a mistake. Ephraim Bell was 58 years old and had been a carpenter in Davenport, Iowa, before the grasshoppers, and the panic sent him west with a tool chest and opinions about every structure he saw. He was the settlement's unofficial authority on anything that involved wood, nails, or the angle of a roof. He had helped raise 4 of the 6 cabins at Holland Bend, and he considered each of them his professional responsibility. He arrived at Orrin's claim on a Friday morning with his hands in his coat pockets and his mouth already set in a line that meant judgment was coming. Bell walked the cabin without asking permission. He kicked the base logs where the chinking should have been. He pressed his thumb into the gaps between the cottonwood rounds and watched daylight appear on the other side. He stood inside and looked up at the half roof, where September sky showed through the unfinished ridge. He counted the woodpile. He opened the stove door and closed it. Then he turned to Orrin, who was standing with a hand on Merritt's shoulder, because the boy had followed him outside and had not stopped coughing since. "You have a roof that leaks smoke," Bell said. "Walls that show daylight through every second seam. One cord stacked where you need 6, and that is cottonwood, which burns like paper and leaves you begging for more by January." He pointed at the north wall, where the logs had not been properly notched, and a gap the width of 3 fingers ran the length of the top course. "I could put my fist through that and touch your stovepipe." Orrin said nothing. Bell crossed his arms. "You need to chink every seam with oakum and clay. You need to finish that roof before the first hard frost, which gives you maybe 5 weeks. You need to haul wood, real wood, not that cottonwood trash, from wherever you can beg or buy it. And you need to trust the stove to do its job if you give it enough fuel." "And if the wind comes through the walls faster than the stove can heat them?" Orrin asked. Bell looked at him the way a schoolmaster looks at a student who has asked something foolish. "Wind does not pull heat through logs. Bad fires do. Build a proper fire, chink your walls tight, and stop looking for trouble that is not there." "I have spent winters on the upper Missouri," Orrin said. "I have seen wind come through a wall like it was not there." "You have spent winters in dugouts," Bell said, and the word carried a weight that had nothing to do with architecture. It meant, "You are not a builder. You are a man who crawled into holes." "This is a cabin. Treat it like one." Bell left a list of what Orrin needed: 6 cords of hardwood, 20 pounds of oakum, 40 pounds of lime for chinking, a second stovepipe section, and labor rye, at least 2 men for a week to finish the roof. The total cost, by Orrin's rough count, came to more than $60. He had $9.80 and a debt note that Broadwick could call due whenever he pleased. Merritt sat on the stove's cold edge and asked, "Is he right?" Orrin looked at the north wall. Through the gap Bell had pointed to, he could see the grass bending flat in the afternoon wind. The stove was unlit because he was saving fuel. The boy's breath made small clouds in the air inside the cabin, and it was only September. "He's right about most of it," Orrin said. "He's wrong about the wind." But being wrong about the wind was not a comfort. It was a death sentence that Bell did not know he had written. The math was simple. Orrin worked it out on a scrap of flour sack with a charcoal nub while Merritt slept under both blankets. He had 1¼ cords of cottonwood stacked against the south wall. Cottonwood burned fast and hot for a moment, then collapsed into ash that gave almost nothing back. A proper hardwood, oak or hickory, would burn slower and throw heat for hours, but there was no oak or hickory within 20 miles. The creek bottoms grew cottonwood, willow, and scrub elm. The elm was better, but cutting and hauling elm with a lamed mule and no partner would take weeks he did not have. He estimated 5 to 6 cords needed for January through March if the cabin stayed as it was. Bare logs, daylight gaps, a roof that funneled wind. That estimate assumed a normal winter. If a norther hit T, the kind he had seen on the upper Missouri, the kind the Texans called a blue norther and the freighters called a black norther, 5 cords would not matter. The wind would steal heat faster than any stove could replace it. Broadwick charged $4 per cord delivered, plus interest on Orrin's existing account. Even if Orrin could buy wood, he could not buy enough. Even if he could buy enough, the cabin would burn through it, because every crack, every gap, every poorly notched seam was a channel for the wind. He was not heating a cabin. He was heating the Nebraska sky and charging himself $4 a cord for the privilege. He had another option. He could surrender Merritt to the settlement, beg passage on a freight wagon to Benkelman, and abandon the claim. Let the land go back to the government. Let someone else prove up. Walk away with nothing but the clothes and the trapping tools and the knowledge that he had broken a dead man's promise. He looked at Merritt. The boy was curled tight under the blankets, his breathing shallow and raspy. The cough had worsened in the last week. A doctor 34 miles away might as well have been on the moon. If Merritt got sicker, there was no one to help. Not at Holland Bend, not on the road, not anywhere Orrin could reach before winter locked the ground. He folded the flour sack and put it in his coat. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat by the cold stove and listened to the wind test the walls, probing each seam the way a man's tongue finds a broken tooth, automatically, relentlessly, without ever stopping. The idea did not come as a revelation. It came as a memory, and the memory came because of ice. 3 weeks after Belle's visit, on a night in early October when the temperature dropped enough to frost the grass, Orrin woke because the stove was still warm. He could feel the iron radiating from 4 feet away, but Merritt's tin water cup, sitting on the plank shelf against the north wall, had filmed over with a skin of ice. Not the whole cup, only the side facing the wall. Orrin struck a match and held it near the cup. The flame bent sideways toward the wall, pulled by air moving through a seam he could not see in the dark. He lit a candle and walked the wall, holding the flame near each log joint. At 3 points, the flame went nearly horizontal. At one point, near the top course where Belle had found the 3-finger gap, the flame blew out entirely. The problem was not cold. Cold was a condition. The problem was movement. Air moved through every crack, every gap, every place where one log did not meet another tightly. The wind outside pressed against the wall, found every opening, and pushed through. The warm air inside, what little the stove had made, rose, hit the leaking roof, and escaped. The cabin was not a shelter. It was a funnel. Cold air in through the walls, warm air out through the roof, and the stove in the middle burning cottonwood for nothing. Orrin had known this once, not in these words, not as a principle he could explain, but he had known it in his body, in his bones, in the memory of a winter he had spent near the upper Missouri 20 years earlier. Amable Caron had shown him. Amable was a Red River Métis freighter who had worked the northern routes between the settlements and the fur posts. He was old even then, perhaps 45, which meant old on the plains, with hands like dried leather and a voice that sounded like gravel poured into a tin cup. He had found Orrin half frozen near a collapsed dugout in January of 1868 and had walked him 3 miles through waist-deep snow to a place Orrin had never seen. It was a stopping place, not a cabin, not a dugout, but something between. Timber ribs driven into a hillside, willow brush woven across them, grass packed over the willow, and earth, heavy, wet, black earth, mounded over everything until the structure looked less like a building and more like a swelling in the ground. Inside, the air was still. Not warm, not in the way a cabin with a roaring fire was warm, but still. The cold could not find its way in. The wind outside shrieked and moaned and threw snow against the earth, but inside the walls did not move, did not breathe, did not betray any seam where the air could pass. Amable had pressed his palm against the inside wall and told Orrin to do the same. The clay was cool, but not cold. Orrin could feel no draft, no movement, nothing but the solid weight of packed earth. "The wind can scream all night," Amable had said, "but it has to argue with the ground before it reaches the fire, and the ground always wins that argument." Orrin had filed the memory the way a man files most lessons learned in youth EO, as something interesting that would probably never matter again. He had gone back to trapping, to freight scouting, to small stock work. He had lived in cabins and line camps and dugouts, and once in a canvas tent for an entire February because he lost a bet. He had never built an earth shelter himself. Now, standing in his leaking cabin with a dead candle and a sleeping boy, he pulled the memory out and turned it over. The earth had not been warm, it had been slow. The heat from the fire did not blast through the walls and escape. It crept into the clay and stayed there, releasing back into the room hour after hour. The wind could not steal what the earth held. And the earth held heat because it was dense, because it was packed, because there were no seams for the air to find a straight road through. Orrin did not need to build a new cabin. He needed to turn this cabin into the earth. The design was not one thing. It was a sequence of problems, each one smaller than the last. First, pack every gap in the log walls with a mix of clay, chopped straw, and wood ash. This would stop the worst of the air movement, the 3-finger gaps, the loose chinking, the places where the wind blew candles dead. Second, nail willow lath diagonally across the outside of the walls. Not straight, because straight lath gave the mud nothing to grip. Diagonal lath created a lattice, fingers for the clay to hold. Third, stack-cut sod bricks against the walls as a base layer. The sod would bond with the clay and give the whole structure weight and mass at the bottom, where cold air pooled. Fourth, plaster the entire exterior in a sloped shell of river clay mixed with chopped hay, prairie grass roots, and straw, 3 feet thick on the north and west walls, where the worst wind came. 2 feet on the south and east, with a low window opening left on the south face so winter sun could reach the interior. Oiled paper instead of glass. Glass cost money Orrin did not have, and oiled paper let light through well enough. Fifth, smooth the roofline so the wind would rise over the cabin instead of hitting the wall face square. A blunt wall caught wind like a sail. A sloped shell sent it over and past. Sixth, dig a shallow drainage trench around the base of the mound 2 feet from the walls. Wet earth against wood would rot. Frozen wet earth would crack. Drained earth would hold. Seventh, build a clay collar around the stovepipe where it passed through the roof. A leak at the pipe meant water in the mud, and water in the mud meant failure. The list was precise. The materials were all available within walking distance of the claim. The labor was the problem. Every part of this was one man's work done by one man with bad knees, split hands, a lamed mule, and a 10-year-old boy who should have been inside resting. Orrin told Merritt the plan over cornmeal mush the next morning. The boy listened without expression, which Orrin had learned was Merritt's way of thinking hard. "Will it look like a hill?" Merritt asked. "It will look like a grave," Orrin said. "That is what they will call it." "Will it work?" Orrin held up one of the clay test balls he had made the night before, fist-sized lumps he had set beside the stove to dry. The first, made of pure creek clay, had cracked down the center like a split walnut. The second, made with sandy clay from the bank, had crumbled when he squeezed it. The third, mixed with chopped straw and a handful of wood ash, held. He could press it, and it gave slightly. He could squeeze it, and it kept its shape. He could drop it on the plank floor, and it bounced once and stayed whole. "This one holds," Orrin said, handing it to Merritt. "A wall is not a ball, but the clay does not know that." Moses Keach found out about the plan 2 days later, because Merritt told Moses' son, and Moses' son told his mother, and Moses' wife told Moses. Moses Keach was 32 from Sangamon County, Illinois, a practical man who had farmed rented land all his life and come west to own something. He was not mean and not generous. He was careful. He owned the cabin nearest Orrin's, 70 yards downslope toward the creek, and he had spent the autumn chinking his walls and stacking cordwood with the focused attention of a man who trusted preparation over luck. He came to Orrin's cabin at dusk, still holding his axe because he had been splitting wood, and stood at the north wall where Orrin had already packed the worst gaps with clay and straw. "My boy says you're going to bury your cabin in mud," Moses said. "That is close enough," Orrin said. Moses ran his hand over the packed clay in the log seam. It was rough, unfinished, still damp in places. He picked at the edge of a straw strand poking out and watched it pull free without disturbing the clay around it. "Wet dirt freezes harder than boards," Moses said. "You know that. A man from Illinois knows that. First hard freeze, this cracks. Second freeze, it splits. Third freeze, you have got chunks falling on your head and your stovepipe pulled sideways." He was not angry. He was genuinely concerned, the way a neighbor worries about a man building a fire too close to his own fence. "And if it does not crack, it smothers your stove. You seal this tight. The smoke has nowhere to go." Orrin conceded every point. He said, "You are right about pure clay. You are right about smoke. You are right that frozen mud cracks. Then why are you doing it?" "Because I cannot buy enough wood to heat a cabin that leaks like this one, and neither can you." Moses' hand stopped on the log wall. He did not answer. "How much have you stacked?" Orrin asked. 4 cords, 4.5 by the end of the week. And if a norther comes, a real one, wind at 80 miles, temperature at 15 below, 3 days, maybe 4. My cabin is chinked, Moses said, but the certainty had left his voice. Chinked stops drafts, Orrin said. It does not stop wind. Wind goes through chinked logs the way water goes through a sieve, slow enough that you think you are dry, but you are still wet. Moses stared at the north wall. Through the unfilled gaps higher up, the last light of October showed orange and cold. My wife has a thin shawl, Moses said. He did not say more. He turned and walked back to his cabin, still carrying the axe, and Orrin heard him splitting wood until full dark. Harder than before, faster, as though more wood could answer a question that wood could not solve. Un. The mockery started at Broadwick's store. Lucian Broadwick was 41, a storekeeper by ambition and a claim speculator by instinct. He had come to Holland Bend not to farm, but to sell nails, flour, axle grease, lamp oil, stovepipe, tar paper, and credit, especially credit. Every dollar a settler owed Broadwick was a thread Broadwick could pull, and he held notes on half the claims in the settlement. He also sold firewood, $4 per cord, delivered by contract teamster from the elm stands upstream. In a hard winter, firewood was not a convenience. It was survival itself. And Broadwick had positioned himself between the settlers and their survival with the comfortable certainty of a man standing beside the only well in a drought. Orrin walked into the store on a Saturday to buy lamp oil, one of the last purchases his $9.80 would allow, and found 4 men standing around the coffee barrel. Ephraim Bell was there. Moses Keach was not. 2 bachelors from the South Claims were there, along with a freight hand waiting for his load. Orrin told them what he had told Moses. Chink every seam, bank the walls with sod, move beds away from windward corners. He said the cabins at Holland Bend were not built for a real norther, and a real norther was coming, maybe not this week, maybe not this month, but before March. Broadwick laughed from behind the counter. It was not a mean laugh, not yet. It was the laugh of a man who has heard something so far outside the boundaries of normal thought that the only possible response is amusement. If dirt was a house, Broadwick said, every gopher would be a banker. The bachelors laughed. The freight hand smiled. Bell nodded once, slowly, which was worse than laughing because it carried the weight of his carpentry authority. Pine tar paper is cleaner than swamp mud, Bell added, and it does not rot your logs. Orrin bought his lamp oil and left. Behind him, he heard Broadwick repeat the line, every gopher would be a banker. And the laughter followed Orrin out the door and across the bare ground between the store and his claim. Within a week, the whole settlement knew. Women at the well pulled their children closer when Merritt came to fill the bucket, not because they feared the boy, but because fever meant trouble, and trouble at Holland Bend clung to Orrin Vale's name like mud to a boot. Children from the South Claims dared each other to climb what they already called Vale's grave. Someone, Orrin never learned who, tied a scrap of black funeral ribbon to one of the willow laths he had nailed to the north wall. The ribbon snapped in the wind like a small dark flag. Broadwick's mockery had a sharper edge beneath the amusement, and Orrin felt it the following week when he returned to the store for nails. Broadwick leaned across the counter and spoke quietly, so the other customers could hear, but could pretend they had not. I will extend your note, Broadwick said. Push the due date to March. Forget the interest through Christmas. All you have to do is stop frightening women about weather. Orrin looked at him. You want me to stop telling people their cabins will kill them. I want you to stop making my customers think they need to bury their houses in a swamp. Half the women in this settlement are already frightened of their first plains winter. They do not need a washed-up trapper telling them the walls are going to breathe. And if I do not stop? Broadwick straightened. Then your note stays where it is, due in full, and I stop extending credit for lamp oil, nails, or anything else. You can dig your dirt walls in the dark. Orrin left without the nails. He walked back in the early dark, the wind cutting across the open ground between the store and his claim, and found Merritt sitting on the cabin floor with his ear pressed to the north wall. "What are you listening to?" Orrin asked. "The wind," Merritt said. "It sounds different where you packed the clay." Orrin knelt beside him. The boy was right. Where the clay filled the seams, the sound was lower, steadier, a hum instead of a whistle. Where the gaps remained open, higher up near the top course, the wind still shrieked through in thin, sharp notes. "Can Broadwick take the cabin before spring?" Merritt asked. The question landed like a stone in still water. The boy had heard. Of course he had heard. Children heard everything, especially the things adults tried to keep from them. "Not if we finish before he decides to try," Orrin said. He did not sleep that night either. He sat with the stove door open, watching the coals, and listened to the wind test the walls. It was October 19th. He had maybe 12 weeks before the worst of winter. He had no nails, no credit, no help, and a child whose cough had not improved in 6 weeks. He had clay, straw, willow, grass, and his hands. In the morning, he began cutting sod. The first sod bricks were bad. Orrin cut them from the bottomland south of the cabin, where buffalo grass and wheatgrass roots held the soil in a dense mat. He used a breaking plow blade that Wade had left behind, dragging it behind the mule in short passes to cut strips 12 inches wide and roughly 4 inches thick. The strips tore unevenly because the mule could not pull straight with its cracked hoof, and Orrin had to guide the blade by hand, pressing down with his boot on the crossbar until his ankle ached. He cut the strips into 3-foot lengths and stacked them against the north wall, grass side down, the way he had seen the sod houses built along the Platte. The bricks held together in his hands. They held together in the stack. But when he pressed them against the log wall above the clay-packed seams, they did not bond. The flat face of the sod sat against the flat face of the log, and the wind found the gap between them immediately. Within 2 days, the first row had shifted 1/2 inch outward. A frost heave would peel them off like bark. He needed the mud shell to hold the sod to the wall. He needed the willow lath to hold the mud. He needed the lath nailed to the logs, and he had no nails because Broadwick had cut his credit. Merritt found the nails, not new nails, old ones, pulled from the scrap pile behind the half-built schoolhouse where a crate had been broken for kindling. Bent, rusted, short. 23 of them, each one straightened on the stove's flat top, with a hammer Orrin had to borrow from Belle, who lent it without speaking and collected it the next morning before Orrin was awake. 23 nails. The north wall needed at least 60. The west wall needed 40 more. Orrin drove the 23 nails into the north wall in a diagonal pattern, each one angled so the willow wands could be lashed between them. He cut the willow from the creek bank with a hand axe, selected the longest and straightest wands, and wove them across the nails in a lattice that looked, he admitted to himself, like something a child would build to trap rabbits. He mixed the first batch of mud on October 22nd. Creek clay, sharp sand from the bank, chopped straw from a wheat stubble field a 1/4 mile east, and enough water to make the mix hold a heel print without shining wet on the surface. He packed it against the north wall over the willow lattice, pressing with his palms, smoothing with a flatboard, building thickness 1 handful at a time. By the end of the first day, he had covered 8 feet of the north wall to a depth of roughly 6 inches. His hands were raw. His knees ached from kneeling in cold mud. Merritt had helped carry straw until the coughing drove him inside. On the second day, the temperature dropped below freezing overnight, and the top layer of the mud cracked in 3 places. The cracks were shallow, surface fractures, not structural failures. But they meant the mix was wrong. Too much clay, not enough straw. The clay shrank as it dried and cracked where the straw could not hold it. Orrin scraped the cracked section off, remixed with more straw, and reapplied. It held better. But 6 inches was not 3 feet, and the north wall was only one of 4, and October was already ending. He worked from first light until his hands could no longer grip the mud. He worked through a fever that lasted 2 days and left him shaking beside the stove while Merritt, 10 years old, coughing, frightened, brought him water and cornmeal mush and did not ask whether they were going to die. Orrin did not know if the boy's silence was courage or shock. He was too tired to find out. By November 1st, The north wall was packed to roughly 12 inches thick over two-thirds of its length. The willow lath held the mud against the logs. The sod bricks set into the mud while it was still damp, bonded better than they had against bare wood. But the top course, the section with Bell's three-finger gap, remained exposed because Orrin could not reach it without a ladder he did not own, and could not build without nails he could not buy. The wind still found the gap. The candle still bent sideways when held near it, and the sky in the northwest was turning the color of iron. Orrin did not know exactly when the worst weather would come. No one did. The planes did not send warnings, but he had spent enough winters watching the sky to know the difference between a season that arrived slowly and one that was gathering itself. The air had a weight to it. The animals along the creek were bunching earlier. The mule stood with its hind quarters to the northwest, even when the wind was calm. Something was building out there, beyond the horizon, beyond the iron sky, beyond anything Orrin could see or measure. And his cabin was not ready. The north wall was half-armored. The west wall was bare. The roof had no shoulder. The drainage trench was a line scratched in the dirt. And he had 11 weeks of winter ahead, a boy who could not stop coughing, and a town that thought he was digging his own grave. The only thing he did not have was the one thing he needed most, someone who knew how to make the earth hold. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? He would not have to wait long. 3 days later, a freight wagon came down the Benkelman Road carrying salt, beans, stove parts, and a 66-year-old Métis teamster who would change everything if the ground did not freeze solid before they could finish. The freight wagon arrived on November 4th, 2 hours before dark. Orrin heard it before he saw it, the grind of iron rims on frozen ruts, the complaint of dry axles, and the particular rhythm of a 4-mule team driven by someone who knew how to keep the animals moving without whipping them. The driver was Amable Caron. Orrin had not seen Amable in 14 years, and in that time the old Métis had shrunk the way old men shrink on the plains. Not weak, but compressed, as though the wind had been filing him down year by year until only the hardest material remained. He was 66. His hands were the same cracked leather Orrin remembered. His voice was the same gravel in a tin cup. He wore a blanket coat patched at both elbows and a wool cap pulled so low it touched his eyebrows. Amable was hauling salt, dried beans, and stove parts from the rail depot at Benkelman to a ranch supply south of the Forks. Holland Bend was not his destination. It was a stopping point, a place to water the mules and rest the wheels before the last 12 miles. He found Orrin's cabin because the cabin was the only structure at Holland Bend that did not look like a cabin. The north wall, half covered in rough mud and sod, jutted from the landscape like a wound that had been packed with dirt. The mud was uneven, cracked in places where Orrin had not mixed enough straw, slumping at the base where water had pooled because the drainage trench was still just a scratch in the ground. Amable climbed down from the wagon, walked to the north wall without greeting Orrin, and broke a chunk of the failed section from the lower course. He held it to his nose. He crumbled it between his fingers. He rubbed the dust between his thumb and forefinger and smelled it again. "Too hungry," Amable said. "Clay needs straw, like a stomach needs bread. You are feeding it dirt and asking it to stand." Orrin came around the corner of the cabin and stopped. He had not expected to feel anything. He was too tired for surprise, too worn for sentiment. But seeing Amable, seeing those hands working the clay the way they had worked it 20 years ago in the earth shelter on the Missouri, cracked something inside him that he had been holding rigid since Wade's death. "Amable," he said. Amable looked at him. The old man's eyes moved from Orrin's face to his hands, split at the knuckles, crusted with dried clay, to his boots, caked with mud, to the cabin behind him with its half-armored wall and its bare, exposed west face. "You remember the stopping place," Amable said. It was not a question. "I remember the wall," Orrin said. "I remember your hand on it." Amable nodded once. He walked the rest of the cabin the way Bell had walked it weeks earlier, but where Bell had kicked and judged, Amable touched and tested. He pressed his palm against the packed section of the north wall and held it there. He crouched at the base where the sod bricks met the mud and pushed sideways with his thumb, checking the bond. He stood at the west wall, bare logs, daylight gaps, no protection, and held his hand flat against the wind. "How many are you?" Amable asked. "Two. Myself and the boy." "How much time?" "I do not know. Weeks, maybe less." Amable looked northwest. The sky was the same iron color Oren had been watching for days. The old man's nostrils flared, and Oren recognized the gesture. Amable was smelling the air the way a trapper smells a change in current, reading something in the wind that had no name but could not be ignored. "I can give you 6 days," Amable said. "The ranch can wait that long. After that, the mules eat more than I earn." 6 days. It was not enough. But it was 6 days more than Oren had expected, and Amable Karen knew things about earth and clay and wind that Oren had only glimpsed once 20 years ago, in a shelter he could barely remember. "Why?" Oren asked. Amable looked at the cabin again, at the rough failing mud on the north wall, at the clay test balls sitting on a flat stone near the doorway, cracked, crumbled, and one that held, at the willow lath nailed in a diagonal pattern with straightened nails pulled from a scrap pile. "Because you already tested the clay," Amable said. "A fool does not test, he just smears." Amable did not lecture. He worked, and the work was the lesson. On the first morning, he sent Merritt to the creek bank with a canvas sack and told him to bring back 2 kinds of dirt, one from the waterline where the clay was gray and sticky, and one from higher up where the soil was sandy and loose. When the boy returned, coughing but carrying both sacks, Amable dumped them on a flat rock beside the cabin and mixed them with his hands. 2 baskets of the gray," he said, scooping handfuls. 1 basket of the sandy, 1 basket of chopped straw. He sent Oren to the wheat stubble field for straw, while Merritt watched him add water from the creek bucket, a cup at a time, kneading the mixture with his fists. Enough water to make a heel print hold. He stamped his boot into the mud. The print stayed, clean-edged, without a wet shine on the surface. If it shines, too wet. If it crumbles, too dry. If the print holds clean, the wall will hold clean. He made Merritt twist a straw rope inside a lump of the wet clay. "Pull it," he told the boy. Merritt pulled. The straw bent and stretched, but the clay around it held, deforming without cracking. If the clay cracks before the straw bends, the mix is too lean, not enough clay. If the straw breaks before the clay moves, too rich. Too much clay, not enough breath in it. He squeezed the lump flat, and it held its shape. "This one lives." Oren watched with the attention of a man whose life depended on remembering every detail, because it did. On the second day, Amable addressed the willow lath. He pulled 2 of Oren's straight-nailed wands from the north wall and shook his head. "Straight lath is a shelf," he said. "Mud sits on a shelf. It does not hold to a shelf." He cut fresh willow from the creek, longer wands, thinner, more flexible, and nailed them diagonally, crossing each other at angles that created diamond-shaped openings in the lattice. "The mud grips like fingers," he said, pushing a handful of the wet mix into one of the diamond gaps. It squeezed through the back and locked against the log behind it. "Now the wind must pull the mud through the willow to move it. The wind is strong, but it is not that strong." They worked the west wall together that day, Amable nailing lath while Oren mixed mud in a trough he had built from scrap boards. Merritt carried straw until his coughing drove him inside, and Oren cut the boys' supper smaller so there would be enough cornmeal for 3 mouths instead of 2. Amable did not eat much. He ate the way old men on the plains ate, enough to work, not enough to notice. On the 3rd day, Amable taught water management. He stood at the base of the north wall, where Oren's scratch-line drainage trench did nothing but collect standing water, and said, "Earth keeps you warm only if you keep water moving away." He took a spade, Oren's only spade, the blade nicked and dull, and cut a proper trench 2 feet from the wall, 8 inches deep, sloped away from the cabin toward lower ground to the southeast. Crown the mud, he said, shaping the top of the mud shell so it rounded outward instead of dishing inward. Flat collects, crowned sheds. A dish is a pond, a crown is a roof. Orrin copied the technique on the west wall while Amable supervised. The old man corrected him twice. Once for cutting too shallow, once for angling the slope toward the cabin instead of away, but otherwise let Orrin's hands learn what his words could not fully explain. On the fourth day, they addressed smoke. Amable climbed a makeshift ladder, 2 cottonwood poles lashed together with rawhide, and examined the stovepipe where it passed through the roof. The collar was a gap packed with rags and clay, already cracking from heat cycles. Amable removed it entirely, built a new collar from wet clay mixed with extra sand for heat resistance, and shaped it into a raised ring that shed water away from the pipe while allowing the pipe to expand and contract with temperature changes. Then he went inside and adjusted the stove. He lowered the draft plate, a flat piece of iron that controlled airflow into the firebox, until the fire burned slower and the smoke drew upward more steadily. Behind the stove, against the east wall, he cut a small opening the size of a man's fist and packed its edges with clay. Air must come in for smoke to go out, he said. Seal the cabin too tight and the smoke pushes back down the pipe into the room. This slot lets cold air in behind the stove, where the iron heats it before it reaches the room. The stove breathes. The people breathe. Merritt, sitting on the floor with a blanket around his shoulders, said, "The cabin breathes too?" Amable looked at the boy for a long moment. "Everything that lives breathes," he said. "The trick is to make it breathe slowly." The progress became measurable, and measuring it kept Orrin sane. Day 4 since Amable's arrival. Every gap in the north and west walls packed with the correct clay straw mix. The gaps that Bell had pointed to, the 3-finger seam, the loose top course, were filled solid. Orrin held a candle to each one after dark. The flames stood upright. For the first time since September, the wind outside did not whistle through the north wall. Day 7. Willow lath finished on the north, west, and half the east wall. The lattice pattern looked rough, but held firm when Orrin pressed against it. Amable tested each section by trying to pull a wand free with his full weight. 2 came loose. He re-nailed them with nails that Merritt had scavenged from the schoolhouse scrap pile. The boy had gone back twice more and found 31 additional nails, each one bent, each one straightened on the stovetop. Day 9. Amable's 6 days ended. He did not leave. He said the ranch would wait and the mules needed rest. Orrin suspected neither was true. He said nothing. Day 12. 112 sawed bricks cut and stacked against the north and west walls as a base layer. Orrin cut them from the bottomland in the early mornings when the frost held the soil firm enough to slice cleanly. Each brick weighed roughly 50 pounds. He carried them 2 at a time on a plank balanced across his shoulders, 70 yards from the cutting field to the cabin. By midday his back seized and he worked on his knees, pressing mud over the sod with his bare hands because his leather gloves had rotted through at the palms. Day 16. The west face reached 2 feet thick. Amable and Orrin packed mud in layers, each one pressed into the last while the previous layer was still slightly damp. "Every layer must bite into the last before freezing," Amable said. "If a layer dries too hard, the next layer sits on top of it like a blanket on a table. A wind lifts blankets. A wind does not lift teeth." Day 18. Ephraim Bell returned. He did not announce himself. Orrin looked up from the mixing trough and found Bell standing 10 feet away, examining the west wall with the expression of a man who is not ready to be impressed but cannot stop himself from looking. "You have an old man helping you now," Bell said. "I have a man who knows Earth," Orrin replied. Bell stepped closer and pressed his thumb into the mud the way he had pressed it into the log gap weeks earlier. This time his thumb did not go through. The surface gave slightly and held. Bell pulled his thumb out and looked at the mark, clean-edged, a heel print in miniature. "The mud will still crack in a hard freeze," Bell said. But his voice had lost the certainty it carried before. He was not pronouncing judgment. He was asking a question he did not want to ask out loud. "It will crack," Amable said from the ladder, where he was packing the junction between the west wall and the roof line. "Everything cracks. Wood cracks. Stone cracks. The question is whether it cracks open or cracks shut. Straw in the clay holds the cracks together. The wall moves, but it does not come apart." Bell looked at Amable for a long time. Then he looked at Orrin. Then he turned and walked back toward his own cabin, without saying another word. He did not offer to help. But he did not repeat Broadwick's line about gophers either. Something had shifted. It was not belief. It was the absence of certainty in the other direction. Day 21. The first hard freeze hit. 10 degrees above zero at dawn, ice on the creek thick enough to walk on. Orrin went outside before light and found what he feared: 3 cracks in the south corner where the mud was thinnest. Each crack ran roughly 18 inches, following the line where the mud met a log seam. One was wide enough to fit a finger. He stood in the dark and stared at the cracks and felt the doubt that had been circling him since October settle into his chest. The temperature was 10 above. In a norther, it could drop to 15 below, 20 below, 30. If the mud cracked at 10 above, what would it do at 15 below with an 80-mile wind driving ice into every fracture? Amable found him standing there an hour later. The old man looked at the cracks without alarm. He broke a piece from the edge of one and crumbled it between his fingers. "Too dry," he said. "You mix this batch on a hot afternoon, and it's set before the straw could bind." He sent Orrin to the creek for water and mixed a repair batch with more straw and wetter clay. They pressed it into the cracks and feathered it outward over the surrounding surface. "Scars are stronger than skin," Amable said. "The repair holds tighter because it grips the broken edges." Day 26. All 4 walls packed and shelled. The north face was 3 feet thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the roofline. The west face matched it. The south face was 2 feet, with the low, oiled paper window set into a clay frame that Amable had shaped with the precision of a man who had built such frames many times before. The east face was 2 feet. The cabin no longer looked like a cabin. It looked like a mound, a swelling in the earth with a stovepipe emerging from the top and a low door cut into the south face. The door was framed in willow and set behind a short entry passage, an L-shaped mud corridor that forced anyone entering to turn a corner, which prevented the wind from driving straight through the opening into the room. Day 28. Amable packed the roof shoulder. This was the most dangerous section, the junction where the wall met the roof line, where snow would drift and water would pool if the angle was wrong. Amable shaped the mud into a smooth curve that sent wind up and over the ridge, rather than catching it. He worked slowly, deliberately, resting every half hour because his breathing had turned shallow and wet. Orrin noticed the breathing. He noticed it the way a trapper notices a change in animal sign, not as a crisis, but as information that something fundamental was shifting. Amable was 66 years old. He had been working in cold mud for nearly a month. He had eaten less than Orrin, slept on the freight wagon floor, and refused to use the cabin's warmth for himself because he said the boy needed it more. "You should rest," Orrin told him. "Rest is for finished men," Amable said. "The roof is not finished." Day 32. The roof shoulder remained incomplete on the northeast corner. Amable could no longer climb the ladder. His cough had deepened, and in the mornings he spat into the snow, and what came up was dark. Orrin worked alone on the shoulder, reaching from the ladder with one hand while holding a ball of mud in the other, pressing it into the curve Amable had started, and trying to match the old man's shaping by memory and feel. He could not match it. The northeast corner was lumpy where the rest was smooth, and the lump would catch wind instead of shedding it. But smooth or lumpy, the shoulder existed. The roof was capped. The walls were shelled. The drainage trenches ran clean. Below the ladder, Merritt stood with his arms crossed, watching. His cough had improved, not gone, but quieter, less ragged, as though the sealed cabin was doing for the boy's lungs what it had not yet done for the weather. "How many days until it is done?" Merritt asked. Orrin looked at the northeast corner. He looked at the sky. "It is done," he said. Whether it is enough is a different question. Moses Keach arrived at dusk on the 33rd day with 2 boys and a spade. He said he was there only because his wife wanted the old fool finished before he killed himself. He did not look at Orrin when he said it. He looked at the wall. Moses worked until moonrise. He did not speak except to ask where to dig and how deep. His boys carried sod from the cutting field, lighter bricks that Moses stacked along the east face where the shell was thinnest. When he left, the east face had gained 4 inches. It was not full conversion. It was not belief. It was the first crack in doubt, and it sounded like a spade cutting frozen ground in the dark. On January 9th, 1888, Orrin sealed the L-shaped entry passage with a final coat of clay and straw. He lit the stove at noon, fed it a quarter log of cottonwood, and waited. He had set a tin cup of water against the north wall, the same test that had shown him the problem in October. The cup sat on the plank shelf, 2 inches from the clay and sod surface. He checked it after 1 hour. The water was cool, but clear. No ice film, not on any side. He held a candle near the north wall at the same spot where the flame had blown out in October. The flame stood nearly upright, a slight waver toward the wall, the mass of cold earth drawing the warm air gently, but no lateral bend, no horizontal pull, no sign of air moving through a seam. Orrin placed a second cup on the floor near the north wall corner, the coldest point in any cabin. After 1 hour, the water was at 38 degrees by his rough judgment, cool to the touch but not freezing. After 3 hours, the same cup felt less cold. He would later estimate 46 degrees at the floor corner. The room was not warm. That was the point Orrin tried to explain to Moses when the neighbor came to see the test. The stove was not roaring. It burned low and steady, consuming wood slowly because the room no longer demanded constant replacement heat. The walls were not radiating warmth. They were not radiating anything. They had stopped stealing. "My cabin holds heat," Moses said. "Your cabin loses heat, and your stove replaces it faster than you notice," Orrin said. "Come here." He led Moses to the south wall, near the oiled paper window. "Put your hand on the clay." Moses put his hand on the wall. It was cool, not warm, not cold. The temperature of a cellar. "Now go home and put your hand on your chinked wall." Moses left. He came back an hour later. He did not say what his wall had felt like. His face said it. His wall was cold, the kind of cold that meant the wind was moving through the chinking, not around it. "This does not prove you survive a norther," Moses said. "No," Orrin said. "It proves the wind has lost its straight path through my walls. Survival is a separate question." Ephraim Bell heard about the test from Moses and came to see it himself. He brought a strip of tar paper, the pine tar paper he had recommended as superior to mud, and held it against the north wall, then against his own cabin wall. On Orrin's wall, the tar paper lay flat. On Bell's, it fluttered. Bell said, "The mud will split when true cold hits." Amable, sitting inside by the stove with a blanket over his shoulders and his breathing shallow, said nothing. He took a strip of cloth from his blanket coat, held it near the stovepipe where it passed through the roof, and watched the cloth draw upward smoothly, steadily. Clean draft, no backdraft, no smoke return. He folded the cloth and put it back in his coat. "Say it," Orrin told him. "I do not need to say it," Amable said. The cloth said it. Broadwick had his own verdict, delivered at the store to anyone who would listen. "Vale has made a cellar above ground. He will bury that boy in smoke before he buries him in mud." 2 bachelors laughed. Moses Keach, standing near the door, did not laugh. He looked at his wife's thin shawl, folded over her arm because the store was warm, and said nothing. On January 10th, the animals along Frenchman Creek bunched nose to tail. The mule stood motionless in the lee of the mud cabin, its hindquarters pressed against the south wall as though the earth itself was the only friend it had left. Prairie hens that had been scratching through the snow all week vanished entirely. On January 11th, a yellow-blue band appeared low on the northwestern horizon. The air warmed. By mid-afternoon, the temperature climbed into the mid-30s. Absurd for January on the plains, warm enough that settlers opened doors and children ran between cabins without coats. Orrin recognized the warmth. He had felt it before, on the upper Missouri, on the Platte, in every place where the plains offered comfort as a lie, the false mercy, the warm breath before the killing cold. He told Moses, "Keep your family inside tomorrow. Keep the stove lit. Keep the door shut." Moses asked why. "Because the sky is lying," Orrin said. He told Bell the same thing. Bell looked northwest, saw the pleasant afternoon, and said Orrin was seeing danger in his own shadow. He told Broadwick, who was sweeping the store's front porch in his shirt sleeves. Broadwick said, "Bale, if the weather listened to washed-up trappers, we would all be dead already." Orrin went home. He fed the stove a half log of cottonwood, more than he usually burned, enough to drive the iron hot and push warmth deep into the clay walls so the mass would be charged when the cold came. He gave Merritt the last of the dried beef and told the boy to sleep in his clothes. Merritt asked, "Is it coming?" Orrin looked at the boy. The cough had quieted in the last 2 weeks. Color had returned to the boy's face. He slept without waking most nights now, curled near the stove in the warm pocket between the iron and the south wall. "Yes," Orrin said. "Will we be all right?" Orrin did not answer. He did not know. January 12th, 1888. Morning came warm and clear, warm enough that Della Keach sent her older boy Ansel to the half-built schoolhouse for the reading lesson that Ephraim Bell gave 3 mornings a week. Warm enough that Broadwick propped his store door open. Warm enough that a cowhand from a distant claim rode through Holland Bend with his coat tied to his saddle. By early afternoon, the horizon changed. It did not darken the way a thunderstorm darkens, slowly, with visible clouds. It changed all at once, as if someone had drawn a curtain across the northwest quarter of the sky. A black-blue wall, flat at the bottom and churning at the top, moved toward Holland Bend faster than any weather Orrin had seen outside of a tornado. The air pressure dropped. The mule screamed. The wind hit first, not a gust, not a building blow, but a wall of air that struck the settlement broadside and did not stop. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the time it took Orrin to close the mud entry. Then it dropped again. The wind carried snow so fine it did not fall. It flew horizontal, a white blur that erased the world beyond arm's length. Orrin could not see the store from his doorway. He could not see Moses's cabin. He could not see the schoolhouse. He could not see anything except the snow driving past the entry passage and the gray-white nothing beyond. Inside the mud cabin, the stove burned steady. The walls did not creak. The stovepipe did not rattle. The wind outside roared, a continuous, sourceless, omnidirectional roar that sounded less like weather than like the sky itself had caught fire. But inside the roar was muted. The clay and sod and packed earth absorbed the sound the way they absorbed the cold, not stopping it, but slowing it, forcing it through 3 feet of mass that took everything the wind offered and gave almost nothing back. Merritt sat near the stove with his knees drawn up. Amable sat against the south wall with his eyes half closed, breathing in the shallow, careful rhythm that had become his normal breathing. The tin cup on the north wall shelf held liquid water. Then Orrin heard Della Keach screaming. The sound came from the east, the direction of Moses's cabin. Orrin could not see Moses's cabin. He could not see 10 feet. But Della's voice cut through the wind the way a blade cuts cloth, high and ragged and unmistakable. Merritt grabbed Orrin's arm. "Ansel," the boy said. "Ansel is at the schoolhouse." Orrin understood. Ansel Keach, Moses's older boy, 11 years old, had gone to the schoolhouse that morning. The schoolhouse was 150 yards northwest of the store, on the far side of the settlement. It had no full chinking. Its north wall was covered with pine tar paper, Broadwick's tar paper, and nothing else. Orrin looked at Amable. The old man's eyes were open now. His breathing was worse. He had one hand pressed to his chest as though holding something in place. "Stay with Merritt," Orrin said. "The rope," Amable said. His voice was barely a whisper. "Tie a rope. From this door to the store porch. If you cannot see, follow the rope back. Orrin found the 40-foot freight rope coiled near the entry passage. He tied one end to the willow frame of the mud cabin's door. He wrapped 3 turns around his left wrist. He stepped into the wind. The cold was not a temperature. It was a force. It hit his face like a flatboard and did not stop hitting. His eyes watered instantly, and the tears froze on his cheeks. The snow drove into his collar, his sleeves, the gaps between his buttons. He could not breathe facing the wind. He turned his back to it and pulled air through his coat collar, tasting wool and ice. He let the rope out as he moved east toward the sound of Della's voice. 20 feet. 30. At 40 feet, the rope ran out. He had not reached anything. He was standing in the white nothing with no rope left and no landmark visible, and Della's screaming coming from somewhere ahead and to the right. He dropped to his knees. At ground level, the snow was slightly thinner. The wind carried the heaviest drift at waist height. He crawled, keeping one hand on the rope and the other sweeping the ground ahead of him. His fingers hit a fence post, the corner of Moses's winter garden enclosure. He knew where he was. Moses's cabin was 12 feet east of the fence corner. He found the cabin by hitting the wall with his shoulder. The door was open. Snow was pouring through it in a horizontal sheet. Moses was inside, trying to hold a blanket over the doorframe while Della pushed past him toward the outside. "Ansel is at the schoolhouse," Della screamed. Her face was white. Not pale. White, the color of flour, the color of absolute terror. "Broadwick went for the children," Moses shouted over the wind. "He took them toward the store." "Broadwick," Orrin said. He looked back toward the white nothing where the store stood, invisible, 80 yards west. Between the store and the schoolhouse, there was no rope, no fence, nothing but open ground and a wind that erased the world. Inside Moses's cabin, the stovepipe moaned. A gust had created back pressure at the pipe's exit, and smoke pushed backward into the room. The cabin filled with a gray haze that made Della cough, and the younger child, Ruth, 4 years old, began to cry. Moses stuffed rags into the north wall seams, but the rags darkened with frost immediately. The cold was not seeping through the chinking. It was driving through it, pushed by 80 miles of wind that treated oakum and clay like suggestions. "Come to my cabin," Orrin told them. "I'm not leaving until Ansel is inside," Della said. Orrin left Moses's cabin and followed the freight rope back to the mud cabin. He tied a second rope, a shorter length, salvaged from the mule's picket line, to the first rope's midpoint, creating a branch that reached toward the store. He could not see the store. He crawled toward it anyway. If you are invested in this story, hit subscribe and stay with us, because what happens next changes everything. He found the store porch by the sound of a door banging. The store's front door had torn from one hinge and swung wildly in the gusts, slamming against the frame with a sound like a rifle shot every few seconds. Inside, kerosene lamps had blown out. The shelves were dusted with snow that had entered through the roof seams. Broadwick was not there. Orrin tied the branch rope to the porch rail and screamed into the wind. "Broadwick!" Nothing. The wind took his voice and shredded it. He circled the store by touch, keeping one hand on the wall. At the back corner, he found tracks. Boot prints filling with snow even as he looked at them, aimed northwest toward the schoolhouse. Broadwick had gone for the children. How long ago, Orrin could not tell. The tracks were almost gone. Orrin followed the tracks until they disappeared. 20 feet from the store's back wall, the ground was blank. Snow had erased everything. He was alone in the white, with no rope, no wall, no track, and a temperature that was dropping through zero toward something his body could not survive for long. He dropped to the ground and crawled northwest, guessing direction by the wind angle. The wind came from the northwest, so crawling into the wind meant crawling toward the schoolhouse. His hands went numb inside his gloves. His beard froze to his coat collar. He counted crawling strides because counting was the only thing that kept him moving. 10, 20, 30. At 37 strides, he heard a sound, not a voice, not a word, a tiny scratching like a kitten pawing at frozen grass. He swept his arm in a wide arc and his hand hit something soft. A mitten attached to a hand, attached to a child curled in the snow with his arms over his face and his legs drawn up, trying to be as small as possible. Ansel Keach, 11 years old, already so cold that his body had stopped shivering, which was the worst sign Orrin knew. Orrin pulled the boy against his chest and stood. The wind nearly knocked him down. He turned his back to it, southeast, toward the settlement, and walked. He could not see the store. He could not see any cabin. He could see the snow and the dark and the white and nothing else. He walked until his legs stopped working properly, and then he stumbled, and then he crawled with the boy on his back, and then his hand hit something hard and curved and cold. Clay. Packed clay with straw strands poking from the surface. The mud cabin. He had hit the west wall. He had come home by accident or by instinct or by the simple geometry of wind and memory, and the wall was solid under his hand. He dragged Ansel through the L-shaped entry passage and into the room. Inside, the stove burned low. The room was warm, not hot, not roaring, warm the way a cellar is warm, steady, deep, untouched by the violence outside. Merritt was where Orrin had left him, near the stove. Amable was on the floor against the south wall, his breathing a wet rattle that Orrin could hear over the muffled wind. The old man had kept the fire fed. He had kept Merritt calm. He had done it while his lungs filled with something that would not come out. Orrin laid Ansel near the stove and peeled the boy's wet mittens off. The fingers were white at the tips, but not hard, not frozen through, not yet. Merritt, without being told, put the kettle on the stove and began warming water. 20 minutes later, Moses and Della arrived. Moses had followed the rope system, freight rope to branch rope to store porch, then the new length Orrin had tied from the porch to the mud cabin's entry. Della carried Ruth, whose lips were blue from the cold inside Moses's own cabin. The smoke in their lungs was almost worse than the cold on their skin. An hour after that, Ephraim Bell came. He did not arrive on his own feet. Moses went back out along the rope and found Bell 40 feet from the mud cabin, crawling on his hands and knees because his legs had cramped from the cold. Bell's cabin had failed. The north wall, chinked with oakum and clay and backed with Broadwick's pine tar paper, had not held. Frost had formed on the inside of the logs along every seam. The stove had burned a full quarter cord in 3 hours, and the floor temperature had still dropped below freezing. Bell's hands were blackening at the fingertips. He had stayed too long trying to feed the fire, believing the fire would save him. "Bell cabin's gone cold," he said when Moses brought him inside. His voice was flat. The authority that had defined his every interaction at Holland Bend was gone. What remained was a man in pain, sitting in a room he had said could not work, alive because it did. Over the next 2 hours, more came. 2 bachelors from the South claims. A woman named Torbjörn Flaten and her 2 daughters, who had been in the store when the front hit and had sheltered there until the store's roof seams began leaking snow onto the shelves. Broadwick himself, who arrived last, led by one of the bachelors who had tied a rope from the store to the mud cabin after realizing the store was failing. Broadwick entered the L-shaped passage and stood in the room and said nothing. He looked at the walls. He looked at the stove, burning low and steady. He looked at Orrin, who was pressing warm cloths against Ansel Keach's hands. He looked at the 21 people crowded into a 16 by 20 foot room that smelled like wet wool and wood smoke and clay and human fear. He said nothing because there was nothing to say that the room did not already say for him. By midnight, the wind outside had not slowed. The temperature, as best Orrin could estimate from the frost patterns on the entry passage walls, was near 15 below zero. The wind drove at 80 miles or more. The combination Orrin did not have the mathematics, but his body knew, was a cold beyond any number. A cold that killed standing men, killed horses in the open, killed anything that was not buried or sealed or hidden from the wind's straight path. The stove consumed less than 1/3 of a cord through the full blow. In Bell's abandoned cabin, nearly a half cord would be found burned to ash in the stove box, and the cabin had still gone cold. The contrast was not a theory. It was charcoal and iron and ice, measurable in the morning if morning came. Amable did not move from the south wall. At some point in the night, Orrin could not say when, because time in the blow had lost its shape. The old man's breathing changed. It went from wet and rattling to slow and very quiet. Orrin knelt beside him and put a hand on his chest. "Is the wall holding?" Amable whispered. Orrin pressed his own palm against the clay behind Amable's shoulder. Cool, not cold. The earth was doing what the earth had done on the upper Missouri 20 years ago, what it had done in the Mandan lodges for centuries before that, what it would do for as long as wind and fire and people existed in the same country. It was arguing with the cold, and it was winning the argument one slow hour at a time. "The wall is holding," Orrin said. Amable closed his eyes. Outside, the wind crossed the rounded earth of the roof shoulder and found no flat surface to strike, no seam to enter, no gap to exploit. It rose over the mound and continued south, carrying snow and cold, and the sound of itself across the open plains toward the creek and beyond. Inside, 21 people breathed. The stove burned low, the walls held, and somewhere between the store and the schoolhouse, out in the white nothing, a cowhand from a distant claim who had ridden through Holland Bend that morning with his coat tied to his saddle lay beside a hayrack with his hand frozen to the wood and did not breathe at all. Morning came the way mornings come after a killing blow, not with relief, but with silence. The wind stopped between 4 and 5 o'clock, and the silence that replaced it was so total that Delakeach woke from a half-sleep against the south wall and said, "Are we dead?" They were not dead. 21 people in a 16 by 20-foot room, breathing stale air and wood smoke and the smell of wet wool and fear, alive because the walls had held and the stove had burned low, and the wind had found no straight road through 3 feet of packed earth. Orrin opened the L-shaped entry passage and stepped outside into a world he did not immediately recognize. The snow lay in hard ribbons across the ground, not drifted smooth, but carved into ridges and bare patches by the wind, so the landscape looked like the bed of a drained river. Between the ribbons, the frozen grass showed brown and brittle. The sky was the pale blue of deep cold, cloudless, utterly still. The temperature was well below zero, but without the wind, the cold was a different thing, present but motionless, a condition instead of an assault. Bell's cabin stood 70 yards north with its door hanging crooked on one hinge. The stovepipe tilted at an angle that meant the interior collar had shifted. Through the open doorway, Orrin could see frost on the inside walls. Not condensation, not dampness, but actual frost, white and crystalline, running along every log seam like veins in a leaf. Moses's cabin had its stovepipe bent sideways where a gust had caught the top section. The pipe had not separated, but the joint leaked, and a line of soot ran down the exterior wall where smoke had escaped. Broadwick's store looked intact from the front, but the rear wall, the north-facing wall that caught the full force of the blow, was rimmed with frost on the inside. Flour sacks nearest the wall had hardened. A molasses barrel had split where the contents froze and expanded. Orrin stood in the cold morning and looked at the mud cabin behind him. The rounded surface was dusted with snow that clung to the rough clay, but the shell was whole. No cracks visible from outside, no slumping, no sections pulled away from the logs. The drainage trench had caught meltwater during the warm spell 2 days before and channeled it away, so the base of the mound was dry. The stovepipe stood straight inside its clay collar, sealed and stable. The cabin looked like a hill, a rise in the land with smoke coming out of the top. It did not look like something a man had built. It looked like something the ground had done on its own, and perhaps that was the point. A shelter that the wind treated as earth rather than as an obstacle. Ephraim Bell came to see the wall at noon, after the others had filtered out of the mud cabin in small groups, returning to their own homes to assess the damage. Bell came alone. He walked slowly because his feet hurt. The frostbite at his fingertips had counterparts at his toes. though less severe, and he stood in front of the north wall for a long time without speaking. Then he put his palm against the clay. Orrin watched from the entry passage. He did not interrupt. This was a man meeting a fact that contradicted everything he had said for 3 months, and the meeting needed to happen without an audience of more than one. Bell moved his hand across the surface. He pressed with his fingers at the spots where log seams lay beneath the clay, the places he had found daylight through in September. His fingers found clay, packed, cold, dense, unyielding clay with straw fibers holding it together and sawed bricks beneath it, and willow lath binding it to the logs. "I told them bad fires killed heat," Bell said. He did not turn around. He spoke to the wall, or to himself, or to the version of himself that had walked this same cabin in September and pronounced judgment with a carpenter's certainty. It was bad walls. Orrin said nothing. Bell turned. His hands were wrapped in cloth because the frostbitten fingertips could not bear the cold air directly. His face had the look of a man who has been forced to revise not just an opinion, but an identity. He had been the building authority at Holland Bend. He had told settlers how to chink, how to roof, how to lay a stovepipe. He had told Orrin that wind did not pull heat through logs, and then the wind had pulled heat through his logs until he crawled to the mud cabin on his hands and knees. "How cold did your floor get?" Orrin asked, not to humiliate, to establish the fact. "Below freezing," Bell said, "with a half cord burning. Below freezing, Orrin." "And mine stayed above freezing with less than a third cord." Bell nodded. He looked at his wrapped hands. "Show me the wall from the inside." They went inside. Orrin showed him the north wall surface, clay oversawed over willow lath over packed log seams. Bell pressed his palm where he had pressed it in September, the spot where his thumb had gone through to daylight. His thumb did not go through. The surface gave slightly under pressure and held, cool but not freezing, dense but not rigid. "Not hotter fire," Bell said slowly. "Slower loss." "Slower loss," Orrin said. Bell asked to see the drainage trench. He asked to see the roof shoulder. He asked about the clay mix, the straw ratio, the willow lath pattern. He asked questions the way a carpenter asks questions, with his hands touching each element, testing joints and angles and thicknesses. And Orrin answered by showing, not telling, because that was how Amabel had taught him, and that was how the knowledge made sense. When Bell left, he stopped at the entry passage and said, "My hands cannot hold a shovel for weeks, maybe longer." He held up the wrapped fists. "But I can tell other people where to dig." It was not an apology. It was better than an apology. It was an offer of the one thing Bell still had, knowledge of structures, of angles, of how buildings fit together, placed in service of a method he had spent months dismissing. The authority had not been destroyed. It had been redirected. Moses Keach came the next day, and his visit was different from Bell's. Moses did not need to be converted. Moses had already cracked on the night he brought 2 boys and a spade to the east wall. What Moses needed was confirmation. Specific, measurable, undeniable confirmation that the method was not luck. Orrin showed him the woodpile. He had kept rough track of consumption during the blow. The mud cabin, heating 21 people for approximately 14 hours of sustained wind and extreme cold, had burned less than 1/3 of a cord. Bell's cabin, heating 1 man for the same period, had burned nearly a half cord and still failed. "That is not possible," Moses said. "It is not about the stove," Orrin said. He picked up a piece of charcoal from the stove box and drew on the flat face of a log near the doorway. 2 rectangles, one labeled Bell, one labeled Vale, arrows pointing outward through the walls of the Bell cabin, heat escaping through every seam, arrows pointing inward at the Vale cabin and stopping at the thick wall. Not hotter fire, slower loss. Moses studied the drawing. He touched the charcoal lines with his finger. He was a practical man, and practical men understood arithmetic even when they resisted theory. "Della wants to know how to bank our cabin before the next blow," Moses said. "Start with the north wall," Orrin said. Chink every seam first, then lath, then sod, then mud, 3 feet north and west, 2 feet south and east. Drainage trench 2 feet from the base sloped away. Crown the mud, never dish it. How long? With 2 men and your boys? 12 days in cold weather, 8 if the ground stays soft. Moses nodded. He looked at Orrin the way a man looks at someone he has underestimated and knows it. Not with shame exactly. Moses was too practical for shame, but with the particular respect that comes from watching a prediction prove true under the worst possible conditions. 2 bachelors from the South claim stopped me this morning, Moses said. They want to know if they can pay you in labor. I do not want payment, Orrin said. I want them to help Bell first. Bell's hands cannot hold a shovel. His cabin needs banking before the next front, and he cannot do it alone. Moses looked at Orrin's own hands, still split at the knuckles, still rough with dried clay. You will not take help for yourself? I already have walls, Orrin said. Bell does not. The community came to Orrin in 1s and 2s over the following days, each carrying a specific need. Della Keach wanted her cabin's north wall banked before the next blow. A bachelor named Peter Lunde wanted to know if the method worked on a half dugout. His claim had a partial sod structure with a timber front, and he thought banking the timber section might seal it. Torbjörg Flaten, the Norwegian widow who had sheltered in the mud cabin with her 2 daughters, asked whether she could bank with sod alone if the creek clay was too frozen to dig. Orrin answered each question with the specificity that the method demanded. For Della, chink first, lath second, sod and mud third. For Peter, the half dugout was already earth on 3 sides, so banking the timber front and sealing the roof junction would convert it entirely. For Torbjörg, sod alone was better than nothing, but without the clay straw plaster to seal the gaps between bricks, the wind would still find paths. If the creek clay was frozen, she could dig below the frost line near the bank. The clay 2 feet down would still be workable. He taught the way Amabel had taught him, by doing. He went to Della's cabin and packed the first 3 log seams himself, showing her the heel print test, the straw twist test, the candle flame test for drafts. He showed Peter how to key the willow lath into the timber face of his half dugout. He drew Torbjörg a diagram in charcoal on her cabin floor, wall layers, drainage trench, crowned surface, and told her youngest daughter Sigrid to correct her mother if the drainage slope ran toward the wall instead of away. Broadwick watched all of this from the store. He did not participate. He did not help. He did not bank his own store, which still bore the frost damage from the blow. Split flour sacks, a warped rear door, molasses frozen and rethawed into a sticky ruin on the back shelf. On January 19th, the week after the blizzard, Broadwick made his move. He stood on the store porch where 3 settlers had gathered to buy stovepipe fittings and said loudly enough for Orrin to hear from the well, "Any tight room would have done in that blow. Pack enough bodies in any 4 walls and you will keep warm. Vale got lucky with a crowd. It was not the mud. It was the people." Orrin heard the argument. He understood it. It was the argument of a man who could not admit that another man's knowledge had been right, and his own product, tar paper, firewood, credit, had been wrong. He walked to the store porch. He did not raise his voice. He handed Broadwick a candle. "Hold it beside your door," he said. Broadwick stared at the candle. Then he held it at the edge of the store's front door frame, the door that had torn from one hinge in the blow and had been rehung crooked, leaving a gap at the top corner. The flame bent sideways. Not violently, the day was calm, the wind light, but visibly, unmistakably, the air moved through the gap and pulled the flame toward it. "Now hold it at my door," Orrin said. Broadwick did not move. He did not need to. The 3 settlers on the porch had seen the flame. They had seen the gap. They understood, in the way that practical people understand practical demonstrations, that a tight room was not the same as a sealed room, and that the wind found every crack it was allowed to find. Broadwick blew the candle out and set it on the porch rail. He went back inside the store without speaking. Amabel survived the blow, but did not recover from it. In the days after the blizzard, while the settlement assessed damage and began the first awkward conversations about banking walls, Amable sat by the stove in Orrin's cabin and breathed. That was all he did. He breathed, and each breath cost him something visible, a slight tightening around his eyes, a careful expansion of his chest as though his lungs had to be coaxed into accepting air. Orrin brought him broth. Merritt brought him water. They did not discuss the breathing because discussing it would require acknowledging what Orrin already knew, that Amable's lungs had been failing before the blow, that the month of cold mud work had deepened whatever lived inside his chest, and that the blow itself, 14 hours of breathing stale air in a crowded room, had not helped. On the third day after the storm, Amable asked Orrin to sit beside him. "You must teach the method as borrowed knowledge," Amable said. His voice was quiet but clear, the way a man speaks when he has limited breath and does not intend to waste any. "Not your miracle. Not Vale's method. The earth taught this. The Mandan taught this. The Métis taught this. I taught you because an old man taught me, and that old man learned from a woman whose name I never knew." "I am calling it earth banking," Orrin said. "Good. A method with a man's name attached becomes the man's property. A method with the earth's name attached belongs to whoever needs it." Amable looked at the south wall, where the oiled paper window let in a square of winter light. "Teach Moses to lead the crews. He's careful, and he listens. Teach Bell to inspect. He knows structures better than you, and his pride will recover faster if he has useful work. Teach the widow Flatten through her daughter. The girl is quicker than the mother." "And Broadwick?" Amable smiled. It was a small smile, more in the eyes than the mouth. "Broadwick will teach himself. A man who sells what people need learns to sell what people want. When the settlement wants earth banking, Broadwick will sell straw by the bundle and call it his idea." Through the rest of January and into February, Orrin and Amable worked together on the improvements that the blizzard had revealed. The northeast corner of the roof shoulder, the lumpy section Orrin had finished alone, had held but had caught a drift that added weight to the clay. Amable directed repairs from inside the cabin, telling Orrin where to shave, where to add, where to smooth. They communicated through the wall, Orrin knocking on the outside to mark his location, Amable pressing his palm on the inside to confirm thickness. On the days when Amable felt strong enough to stand, they worked on a project that had no immediate survival purpose, but that Amable insisted on, a clay model of the banking method, built on a flat board, showing wall layers, drainage trench, crowned surface, an L-shaped entry. The model was the size of a bread loaf. It sat on the floor near the stove, and when settlers came to ask questions, Amable pointed to the model instead of speaking, saving his breath for corrections. "You're building a school," Orrin told him. "I'm building a memory," Amable said. "Schools close. Memories travel." On February 14th, a second cold front hit Holland Bend. Not as severe as the January blow, the temperature dropped to 5 below with moderate wind, but enough to test the two cabins that had been banked since the blizzard. Delakeech's north wall held. The candle test showed no draft. Petter Lunde's half dugout, with its banked timber front, stayed above freezing at the floor with a small stove. Bell's cabin, partially banked by the two bachelors working under Orrin's direction, performed better than before, but still leaked at the unfinished east seams. The second front convinced the remaining doubters. Not through argument, but through arithmetic. The banked cabins burned less wood and stayed warmer. The unbanked cabins burned more and stayed colder. The numbers were not dramatic, a few degrees, a fraction of a cord. But on the plains, a few degrees was the difference between frozen water and liquid water, between frostbitten fingers and working hands, between a child who coughed through the night and a child who slept. In late February, Amable asked to be moved to a cot beside the stove. He had been sleeping on the floor against the south wall, wrapped in his blanket coat, refusing the cot because he said the boy needed it. But Merritt's cough had improved enough that the boy could sleep on the floor with blankets, and Amable's breathing had worsened enough that lying flat on the ground left him gasping by morning. Orrin moved the cot. He arranged it so Amable faced the south wall's oiled paper window, where the late winter light came through in a warm square that moved across the floor as the day turned. On March 2nd, after a wet snow that clung to the mud cabin's surface and then melted in an afternoon thaw, Amable asked Orrin to help him stand. They walked together to the schoolhouse, where Bell was directing two men in banking the north wall. Amable leaned on Orrin's arm and watched the work. He corrected one drainage angle with a gesture, hand tilted away from the wall, meaning the slope was wrong, and approved the rest with a nod. Then he asked to sit beside the schoolhouse stove. The building was warm. The north wall, partially banked, blocked the worst drafts. Children sat on benches and watched the old man the way children watch anything old and strange, with curiosity untempered by the politeness adults use to disguise their staring. Amable told them about the stopping place on the upper Missouri. He told them about willow ribs and grass and earth packed in layers. He told them that a wall was not strong because it stood, but because the wind could not find a straight road through it. His voice was barely above a whisper, and the children leaned forward to hear, and the room was quiet except for his words and the stove and the wind outside pressing against the banked wall and finding nothing to enter. He died 4 days later, on March 6th, in Orrin's cabin, on the cot beside the stove. He died in the early morning, before light, while Merritt slept and Orrin sat in the chair he had placed beside the cot 3 nights earlier and had not left since. Orrin knew the moment because the breathing changed one final time, from slow and careful to absent, a silence that was different from all other silences because it had no expectation of resuming. He sat with Amable for an hour after the breathing stopped. The stove burned low. The walls held the warmth. Outside, a March wind tested the cabin and found nothing, the way it always found nothing now. In the morning, Orrin found Amable's palm print hardened in a patch of clay near the stove on the south wall where the old man had pressed his hand during the blizzard to test the thickness. The print was clear, 4 fingers spread wide, the heel of the palm deep in the clay, the lifelines visible in the dried surface. It had hardened while the cabin was crowded with 21 bodies and the stove burned through the longest night, and no one had smoothed it or covered it or thought to preserve it, because no one knew it would be the last mark the old man's hand would make. Orrin did not smooth it out. He left the print in the wall beside the stove, and later, when the cabin was quiet and Merritt was asleep, he pressed his own palm against the wall next to it. His print was larger, rougher, the fingers thicker, but the gesture was the same, a man asking the earth whether it would hold. April came with mud and water and a crisis that had nothing to do with cold. The thaw hit Frenchman Creek in the second week of April, rapid and total. Snowmelt from the upstream drainage flooded the creek bed, and the water rose 3 feet in 2 days. The bottomland where Orrin had cut sod became a shallow lake. The drainage trenches that had protected the mud shells all winter filled with slush and overflow, and the water had nowhere to go because the frozen ground beneath the trenches had not thawed enough to absorb it. Orrin woke on April 11th to standing water 6 inches from the base of the mud cabin. The drainage trench was full. Water pressed against the sod bricks at the bottom of the north wall, and the clay above the waterline had darkened where moisture was wicking upward through the earth. If the water reached the clay straw layer and stayed, the wall would soften, not collapse. The willow lath and sod bricks would hold the structure, but soften enough to compromise the seal. Wet clay against log would rot the wood, a summer of rot, and the cabin would need to be stripped and rebuilt from bare walls. Orrin cut relief trenches before breakfast. He dug 2 channels from the full drainage trench outward toward lower ground to the southeast, opening a path for the standing water to drain. The work took 4 hours. By the time he finished, the water level at the base of the wall had dropped 2 inches. But the flood was not Orrin's only problem. Broadwick had been waiting for this. 2 days after the flood began, he stood in front of what passed for a settlement council. Bell, Moses, Torbjörg Flatten, and 2 other claim holders, and announced that Orrin Vale's mud method was damaging the cabins it was supposed to protect. He claimed the water damage to the mud shells would rot the logs beneath them, that the settlers who had banked their cabins at Orrin's urging would find their walls destroyed by spring, and that Orrin should be held responsible for the cost of repair. He told you to pack mud against your timber, Broadwick said. Now the timber sits in wet dirt. By July, those logs will be soft as cheese. Who pays for that? Vale with his $9? Or you with the cabins you cannot sell and cannot repair? The accusation landed because it carried a grain of truth. Wet earth against wood did cause rot. Orrin knew it. Amable had known it. And the drainage system existed precisely to prevent it. But the flood had overwhelmed the drainage. If the water stayed, Broadwick would be right. Bell answered before Orrin could. The mud saved 21 lives in January, Bell said. His hands were still wrapped, the frostbitten fingertips healing but not healed, and he held them up when he spoke, not as an accusation, but as evidence. My cabin was chinked and papered. It went cold in 3 hours. Orrin's held all night. January is past, Broadwick said. April is here. And April says your mud is a sponge. April says the drainage needs clearing, Orrin said. He explained the principle, the same principle Amable had taught him, the same lesson from the upper Missouri. Earth protected as long as water moved away. The drainage trenches had been designed for winter runoff, not spring flood. They needed to be deeper, wider, with relief cuts to lower ground. And who digs those trenches? Broadwick asked. You, with your $9 and your 1 mule? Everyone digs, Orrin said, the way everyone sheltered in January. Broadwick did not have an answer for that. The memory of 21 people in Orrin's cabin was too recent and too vivid to argue against. He left the council without resolution, which was itself a small victory. Broadwick had wanted a ruling against Orrin, and he had not gotten one. But the flood was not finished with Holland Bend. On April 14th, while Orrin and Moses led a crew of 4 men cutting relief trenches behind the South Claim cabins, Lita Bell, Ephraim Bell's daughter-in-law, 24, married to Bell's son Josiah, who was away hauling freight, went into labor 6 weeks early. The labor started in Bell's cabin, which was partially banked but still leaking at the east seams. The cabin was damp. The floor was muddy where the incomplete drainage had allowed water to seep under the threshold. And the doctor was 34 miles away, across a creek that was running bank to bank with floodwater. Torbjörg Flatten had attended births before. She came to Bell's cabin and found Lita on a wet cot in a room that smelled like mold and creek mud. The stovepipe had shifted during the thaw. The ground movement had tilted the rear support, and smoke leaked into the room at every third gust. Torbjörg sent her daughter Sigrid to find Orrin. Orrin arrived and understood the problem in one sweep of the room. Damp floor, smoke-filled air, a woman in labor who needed warmth and clean breathing. Bell's cabin could not provide either. He moved Lita to the earth-banked schoolhouse. Moses helped carry the cot. Torbjörg brought water and clean rags. The schoolhouse was dry. Its drainage trench had been cut properly, and the full banking on the north and west walls kept the interior sealed. The stove drew clean. The air was warm and still. Lita's labor lasted 11 hours. Orrin did not deliver the baby, Torbjörg did, with Della Keach assisting, but he kept the stove fed, kept the drainage trench clear of the rising floodwater outside, and at one point climbed to the roof to clear a slush blockage from the stovepipe collar that threatened to send smoke back into the room. The baby was born before dawn on April 15th. A girl, small, early, but breathing. Lita named her after her mother, who had died in Iowa, but the settlement called the baby the schoolhouse girl, and later just the clay baby, because she was the first child born inside walls that the earth had sealed. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Broadwick's opposition did not end with the council. It narrowed. In the weeks after the flood, while Orrin organized drainage crews and taught the relief cut technique to every claim holder who would listen, Broadwick quietly refused to bank his own store. He reinforced the rear wall with new planks. He replaced the tar paper on the north face. He re-chinked the log seams with fresh oakum purchased from his own inventory. He did everything except admit that the mud method was superior to the materials he sold. His store sat in the settlement's center like a monument to a different philosophy. Wood, tar paper, oakum, and credity. And every settler who walked past it on the way to the banked schoolhouse could see the contrast. Broadwick's walls were straight and clean and conventional. The schoolhouse's walls were rounded and rough and ugly. But the schoolhouse was dry inside, and Broadwick's store still smelled like mold from the January blow. Orrin did not confront Broadwick directly. He did not need to. The method was spreading through demonstration, not argument. Moses Keach led a banking crew on the South Claims without Orrin present, the first time anyone other than Orrin had directed the work. Moses failed his first mix. The clay slumped off the willow lath in a wet sheet, and the two bachelors assisting him laughed the way men laugh when they are relieved that someone else has made a mistake. Merritt, who had come along to help carry straw, walked to the slumped pile, picked up a fist-sized lump, and twisted a straw rope inside it. The clay cracked before the straw bent. "Too lean," the boy said. "More clay." Moses looked at Merritt. The boy was 10 years old and had been coughing for 6 months and had watched Amable test clay 100 times from his blanket by the stove. Moses adjusted the mix. The next batch held. Orrin heard about it that evening from Moses himself, who told the story with the rueful honesty of a man who had been corrected by a child and knew the child was right. "Your boy knows more about clay than I know about corn," Moses said. "He learned from a better teacher than me," Orrin said. By the end of April, 5 cabins at Holland Bend were fully banked. 3 more were partially complete. The schoolhouse was the best sealed structure in the settlement, and Orrin had begun keeping a list, a board inside the schoolhouse, charcoal on pine, recording each cabin's status: size, wall condition, wood on hand, drainage done or not done. The list was not his idea. It was Amable's, from the clay model sessions, from the old man's insistence that a method must outlive the man who carries it. The spring flood receded. The drainage trenches dried. The mud shells hardened in the warming sun, and the cracks that appeared in the surface were repaired with wet patches that bonded to the old clay and held. The willow lath beneath the mud turned gray and stiff but did not rot, because the drainage had kept the moisture moving, and moving water does not destroy, only standing water does. Broadwick sold straw by the bundle. He did not call it banking material. He called it bedding straw, listed on the account books at 2 cents per pound. But every bundle went to a banking crew, and every banking crew used it for temper in the clay mix, and Broadwick knew it, and Orrin knew he knew it, and neither man said a word about it because the settlement had found its own equilibrium, the storekeeper selling what the settlement needed, the old trapper teaching what the settlement lacked, and the earth between them holding everything together. The summer of 1888 passed in work and recovery. Orrin replastered the south face of the mud cabin, adding an extra 6 inches of thickness where the spring sun had dried the clay too fast and opened hairline fractures. He deepened every drainage trench by 4 inches and added gravel beds at the low points to prevent silting. He built a low sod windbreak 20 paces northwest of the schoolhouse, a 3-foot wall that would catch drifting snow before it reached the banked structure. He did all of it without a mobble, and every technique he used he heard the old man's voice explaining it. Crown, do not dish. Every layer must bite into the last. Keep water moving away. A wall is not strong because it stands. By autumn, Holland Bend was not the same settlement that had laughed at a man burying his cabin in mud. It was a settlement that had survived because of it, and the difference between those two things was measured not in opinions but in charcoal marks on a pine board in a schoolhouse that stayed warm when the wind blew. But Broadwick's store wall was still unbanked, and the sky in the northwest was turning the color of iron again. The second winter announced itself the same way the first had, not with cold, but with silence. The birds left the creek bottom in late October. The mule pressed itself against the south wall of the mud cabin and would not be led to water without a rope pull. The grass along Frenchman Creek turned from yellow to gray to the color of old bone, and the wind shifted northwest and stayed there. Orrin watched the sky and felt the old dread stir in his chest. Not the dread of the unprepared. His cabin was sealed, his drainage clean, his woodpile stacked to 4 cords of mixed elm and cottonwood, the dread of the man who knows what is coming and knows that others have not listened. Broadwick's store was still unbanked. The storekeeper had spent the summer and autumn reinforcing his building in every way except the one that mattered. New planks on the rear wall, fresh tar paper on the north face, double-chinked log seams with oakum imported from Benkelman at a cost he did not disclose. He had replaced the front door with heavier timber and reset the stovepipe with a new iron collar. The store looked solid. It looked professional. It looked like exactly the kind of building that a carpenter like Ephraim Bell would have approved of a year earlier. But it was not banked. The walls were still bare logs behind tar paper and oakum. The wind could still find its straight road through. Orrin said nothing about it. He had learned, in the months since the January blow, that telling Broadwick anything was like telling the wind to change direction. The words went out, and the wind kept blowing. Broadwick would learn, or he would not. The earth did not argue. It simply held, or it did not hold, and the difference was visible to anyone who cared to look. November passed. December came cold and dry, the ground freezing solid by the middle of the month, the creek ice thick enough to drive a wagon across. The settlement hunkered down. 12 cabins were now fully or partially banked, 8 complete with drainage trenches and crowned surfaces, 4 with windward walls only, the emergency banking that Orrin had classified as Level 1. The schoolhouse was the most thoroughly sealed structure at Holland Bend, with 3-foot walls on north and west, 2-foot walls on south and east, a double entry passage, a central stove, and rope lines running to the 4 nearest cabins. On the board inside the schoolhouse, Orrin's charcoal list showed each cabin's status. He updated it weekly, walking the settlement with Merritt, checking drainage, testing walls with the candle flame, noting which structures needed repair before the deep cold. Bell accompanied him on the inspections when his hands allowed it. The frostbitten fingertips had healed into dark, stiff nubs that ached in the cold but could grip a candle. Bell's eye for structural detail made him a better inspector than Orrin, and the 2 men had developed a working partnership that neither would have predicted the previous autumn. Moses Keach had become the crew boss for new claims. When a family arrived at Holland Bend, and families were arriving now, drawn by the rail expansion and the promise of land, Moses met them within a week and walked their cabin with the same appraising eye that Bell had once used on Orrin's. He told them what they needed. He told them what it cost in labor. He told them Orrin Vale would show them how. The settlement had a system. It was not written in any book. It was charcoal on pine, knowledge passed hand to hand, and a rule that every new family received 1 day of community labor before November. The rule was not enforced by any authority. It was enforced by memory, by the 21 people who had crowded into a 16 by 20-foot room on the worst night of their lives and had walked out alive in the morning. The blow came on December 28, 1888. Not a blizzard on the scale of January's All. The wind reached perhaps 50 miles an hour. The temperature dropped to 8 below, and the snow lasted 18 hours instead of the previous storm's grinding duration. But it was enough. It was enough because Broadwick's store failed at the rear wall. Not a collapse. Not a dramatic caving of timber and tar paper. Something quieter and in some ways worse. The north-facing rear wall, double-chinked and freshly papered, had a seam where the top course met the roof plate. The seam had been packed with oakum in September. The oakum had dried and contracted through the autumn. The first hard wind of December had loosened it further, and on the night of December 28th, when the temperature dropped and the wind drove from the northwest at 50 miles an hour, the seam opened. The gap was perhaps the width of 2 fingers, small enough to miss in daylight, large enough, in an 80-degree temperature differential with a 50-mile wind, to drive a column of air into the store's interior that dropped the rear temperature below freezing in less than 2 hours. The molasses barrels stored against the rear wall froze and split for the second time. 2 flour sacks nearest the wall hardened with frost. The kerosene in the rear lamp thickened until the wick would not draw. And the stove, Broadwick's stove, larger than any in the settlement, fed with hardwood, he charged others $4 a cord for, Sinai, burned and burned, and could not keep the rear of the store above freezing because the wind was stealing the heat through a gap that Oakham could not hold. Broadwick discovered the failure at 3 in the morning when he went to check his flour inventory and found the sacks rigid. He touched the rear wall. It was not cold. It was ice cold. The kind of cold that means air is moving through solid wood, carrying every degree of warmth with it. He stood in his own store, in front of his own wall, and understood what Orrin had been telling him for 15 months. At 4 in the morning, Broadwick carried his account books across the settlement to the earth-banked schoolhouse. He did not go to Orrin's cabin. He could not bring himself to go to Orrin's cabin. The schoolhouse was neutral ground, a community structure banked by community labor, belonging to no one man. He could enter it without admitting that he was entering Orrin Vale's world. He found Orrin there. Orrin had come to the schoolhouse at the start of the blow to check the stove and the drainage, as he did every time the wind rose. He was sitting by the stove with a cup of hot water, the charcoal board behind him showing the settlement's status in neat rows. Broadwick stood in the double-entry passage and held his account books against his chest. "My rear wall went," he said. Orrin looked at him. The storekeeper's face was drawn, not with cold, but with the particular exhaustion of a man who has been fighting a fact for over a year and has finally lost. "How bad?" Orrin asked. "Flour's gone. 2 sacks. Molasses froze again." He paused. "The oakum does not hold. I re-chinked it 3 times since summer." "Oakum shrinks when it dries," Orrin said. "The gap opens every time the air changes. You would have to re-chink every month through the winter." Broadwick knew this. He had known it for months, perhaps longer, in the way that a man can know a thing and refuse to let the knowledge reach the place where it becomes action. He stood in the schoolhouse entry with his account books and his failed wall and his 15 months of mockery stacked behind him like cordwood. "I have 6 men needing work," Broadwick said, "and 3 wagons." Orrin set down his cup. "Then send them to Bell's east wall first. It still leaks at the upper seams. After Bell, the 2 new families on the south claims need windward banking before January." Broadwick stared. He had expected what? Orrin did not know. Perhaps he had expected gloating. Perhaps he had expected a negotiation, a trade, a deal that would let him save face. What he got was an assignment. Work to do. A place in the system that did not require him to say the words he could not bring himself to say. "Bell first," Broadwick repeated. "Bell first. His hand still cannot grip a spade properly. He needs men who can." Broadwick hesitated. The hesitation lasted long enough for Orrin to see the full weight of what the storekeeper was setting down, not just his resistance to the method, but his identity as the man who provided what the settlement needed. He had been the source of supplies, the holder of credit, the commercial center of Holland Bend. Now the settlement needed something he had not sold and could not sell, and the man who provided it was an old trapper he had mocked as a gravedigger. Then Broadwick nodded. He left the schoolhouse and walked back to his store in the dark, and the next morning he sent 3 men with shovels to Bell's east wall. The conversion was not sentimental. There was no handshake, no apology, no scene of reconciliation. Broadwick did not become Orrin's friend. He became something more useful, a man with resources who directed those resources toward the work that needed doing. He sold straw by the bundle and no longer pretended it was bedding material. He listed clay-mixing trowels on his inventory sheet next to the oakum he still stocked. He charged for his goods and his men's labor because Broadwick was a storekeeper and would always be a storekeeper, but he charged for the right goods now. His store got banked in January by his own men, under Moses Keach's direction. Orrin came once to check the drainage slope and found it wrong, running toward the wall instead of away. He told Broadwick to recut it. Broadwick recuted it. The second slope was wrong too, and Orrin made him cut it a 3rd time, standing over the trench with his arms crossed while Broadwick's hired man dug, and Broadwick himself held the grade stick and said nothing. The 3rd slope ran clean. Cora Vint arrived at Holland Bend in March of 1889 on a freight wagon from Kearney with a canvas roll, a sewing kit, 2 cookpots, and a letter of introduction from a land agent who had told her the settlement needed a cook. She was 38, widowed. Her husband, a hotel clerk in Kearney, had died of pneumonia 18 months earlier, leaving her with no property, no children, and skills that were portable: sewing, cooking, bookkeeping, and an ability to organize supplies that came from 8 years of running a hotel kitchen where the budget never matched the menu. She came to Holland Bend because the land was cheap, the claim requirements were clear, and she had calculated assureng on the back of her husband's death certificate in pencil because she did not waste good ink on rough numbers. That she could prove up on 160 acres if she could survive 2 winters without buying more than she earned. Orrin met her at Broadwick's store, where she was negotiating flour prices with the intensity of a woman who knew exactly what flour cost at the Kearney Depot and exactly what margin Broadwick was adding. She had the flour price down to 6 cents per pound below Broadwick's posted rate before Orrin finished tying the mule outside. "Who taught you to bargain?" Broadwick asked, not with admiration, but with the wariness of a man who has met his match across a counter. "My husband's creditors," Cora said. "They came often enough for me to learn." Orrin's first conversation with Cora was not about survival or earth banking or anything larger than a practical question. She had claimed a quarter section east of Moses Keach's land, and the cabin on it, Paul, a previous claimant's abandoned structure, had a collapsed roof and 3 standing walls. She asked Orrin whether it was worth repairing or whether she should start fresh. Orrin walked the cabin with her. The walls were cottonwood, poorly notched, but sound at the base. The roof had failed because the ridgepole was undersized, not because the walls could not carry the load. 2 walls faced north and west, the killing directions. "Bank these 2 walls and fix the roof," Orrin said. "You can winter in it." "Show me how," she said. Not as a request, as a transaction. She had something to trade. What she traded was canvas. She had 3 bolts of heavy canvas from the hotel, tablecloth material too coarse for fine sewing, but exactly the right weight for interior draft curtains. She sewed hanging quilts, canvas panels lined with stitched-in straw padding that could be hung from ceiling pegs inside a cabin, creating a dead air space between the quilt and the wall that acted as a second insulation layer. The quilts did not replace banking, but in partially banked cabins or cabins waiting for full treatment, they cut drafts by half. Orrin recognized the principle immediately. Dead air, air that did not move, was nearly as good an insulator as packed earth. Cora had invented, without any knowledge of Earth Lodge traditions or Amable Karen's teachings, a textile version of the same principle. Stop the air from moving, and the heat stayed where the stove put it. He showed her clay testing. She showed him supply tracking. He taught her the drainage principle. She taught him to keep a written record: cabin name, date banked, wall thickness, drainage status, last inspection, that replaced his charcoal board with a cloth-bound ledger that could be updated without erasing. The courtship, if it could be called that, happened through shared work. They banked Cora's cabin together over 4 days in April. She mixed clay faster than Orrin because she treated it like bread dough, kneading with the heels of her hands instead of pressing with flat palms, and the mix came together more evenly. He corrected her drainage slope. She corrected his record keeping. They argued about the south wall thickness. Orrin wanted 2 feet, Cora wanted 18 inches to preserve the window opening, and compromised on 20 inches with a wider oiled paper pane that she framed in willow and sealed with tallow. They did not discuss feelings. They discussed walls and drainage and straw ratios, and whether Broadwick's new trowels were worth the 15 cents he charged. They discussed Merritt's cough, which had finally stopped in February and had not returned. They discussed Amable, whom Cora had never met, but whose palm print she had seen in the wall of Orrin's cabin and had stood before for a long time without speaking. "He taught you this," she said. "He taught me to remember what I had already seen," Orrin said. "The earth taught the rest." By the autumn of 1889, Cora had become the settlement's record keeper. She maintained the cabin status ledger, tracked supply needs for banking crews, and organized the one-day community labor requirement so that no new family was last in line because they had arrived late or lacked connections. She posted the schedule at Broadwick's store, which meant Broadwick had to look at it every day, which meant Broadwick knew exactly who needed what and when, which meant Broadwick's inventory slowly, grudgingly, but completely shifted to match the settlement's actual needs. They married in 1891 on a May afternoon in the schoolhouse, with Bell officiating because no minister had yet come to Holland Bend. Moses Keach stood as witness. Merritt, now 14, stood beside Orrin and did not cough. The years compressed the way years do when the crisis has passed and the work becomes routine. Not easy. Nothing on the plains was easy, but patterned, predictable, survivable. By 1892, Holland Bend had 12 fully banked cabins, one earth-banked schoolhouse, with a double entry and rope lines to 4 adjacent structures, 2 sod windbreak lanes running northwest to southeast to catch drifting snow, and Cora's ledger system tracking every structure's status through the seasons. The one-day labor rule held. New families arrived, proved up, built cabins, and banked them the way a man plants a fence. Not because someone told them to, but because the settlement's customs included it the way breathing included exhaling. Bell became the settlement's strongest advocate for earth banking. His authority, cracked by the January blizzard, had reformed around the new method with the strength of a repaired wall, scarred but sound. He inspected every new banking job with the same eye he had once used to judge log cabin construction, and he was harder on bad drainage than Orrin was, because Bell understood structures well enough to know that water killed more buildings than wind. Moses Keach became the crew boss for all new claims north of the creek. He ran his crews the way he farmed, carefully, methodically, without waste. He still failed a clay mix occasionally, and when he did, he called for Merritt, who would walk over from whatever he was doing, twist a straw rope in a clay lump, and tell Moses what the mix needed without looking up. Broadwick adapted. He was a storekeeper. Storekeepers survive by selling what people buy, and what people at Holland Bend bought was straw, trowels, spade blades, and stovepipe fittings designed for clay collars. Broadwick stocked them all. He made a margin on each. He did not credit Orrin for the shift in demand, and Orrin did not ask him to. The settlement's economy had absorbed the method the way the earth absorbed heat, slowly, deeply, without any single moment of transformation. Merritt grew. By 1893, he was 16, tall and quiet, with his Uncle Wade's serious face and Orrin's capacity for sustained work. He took a job as a freight clerk at the Benkelman Depot, recording shipments and schedules, and he applied the same precision to storm tracking that Cora applied to cabin records. When a telegraph report suggested a cold front moving across the northern plains, Merritt sent word to Holland Bend by the first available rider, and the settlement had time to check drainage, stock stoves, and rig rope lines before the wind arrived. He did this not because Orrin asked him to. He did it because he remembered the sound of 21 people breathing in a 16 by 20 foot room, and he remembered the silence when Amable stopped breathing, and he remembered the scratching of his own fingernails against frozen grass when Orrin found him outside in the blow, though he had been too young to understand at the time what the scratching meant. Orrin and Cora lived in the mud cabin, which by 1895 looked less like a cabin and more like a permanent feature of the landscape. A low rise with a stovepipe and a south-facing window, and a drainage system that Orrin maintained with the seasonal attention of a man tending a garden. The walls had been replastered twice, each time stronger than the last. The willow lath beneath the clay had hardened into a lattice as rigid as iron. The sod at the base had rooted into the soil below it, and grass grew on the lower slopes of the mound in summer, so that by July the cabin was half green, a structure that the earth had begun to reclaim even as it continued to serve. Orrin lived into the early 1900s. He saw frame houses arrive at Holland Bend, built with milled lumber from the expanded rail line, and finished with clapboard and tar paper that was better than anything Broadwick had sold in 1887. He saw the need for full mudshells diminish as construction improved and fuel supply became more reliable. He did not mourn the change. The method had been born from necessity, and when necessity eased, the method could rest. But he never fully trusted bare walls in a wind. On December nights, when the sky turned iron and the mule pressed itself against the south wall, Orrin still walked the settlement with a candle, testing seams, checking drainage, pressing his palm against the clay the way Amable had pressed his palm against the earth shelter on the upper Missouri, not to measure temperature, but to ask the wall a question that only the wall could answer. Is it holding? The wall always answered the same way. Cool, dense, unyielding. The straw fibers rough against his skin. The earth behind it solid and slow, absorbing whatever the night sent and giving almost nothing back. What? By the third winter after the Great Blow, more than 40 settlers across Holland Bend and the neighboring claims had learned the earth banking method. The spread was specific and traceable. Not a legend, not a rumor, but chalk marks on cabin walls showing where to cut drainage, straw twist tests performed by children who had learned from Merritt, who had learned from a Mobble, and a cloth-bound ledger in Cora's hand, recording every structure's thickness, condition, and last inspection date. Orrin lived out his later years at Holland Bend with Cora, Merritt nearby at the Benkelman Depot, and the old mud cabin slowly grassing over until it looked less like a building than a rise in the land. Visitors who came to Holland Bend after 1895 sometimes walked past it without knowing a house was there. Orrin considered that the highest compliment the earth could pay to anything a man had built. He died in spring, not winter, which mattered to Cora because the ground was soft and open and no one had to cut his grave with an axe. She buried him on the south slope of the claim, where the drainage ran clean and the wind passed over without stopping. In Broadwick's store, the same store whose rear wall had failed twice before banking, whose front porch had held the candle that proved what Oakham could not do, a banked north wall rose 3 feet thick behind the original logs, and a drainage trench ran along the base that Orrin had made Broadwick cut 3 times because the first 2 slopes were wrong. During one last hard wind in the winter of 1899, children from the south claimed sheltered in the schoolhouse. The stove burned low. The walls held. Broadwick's old line, "If dirt was a house, every gopher would be a banker," had passed into settlement memory as the kind of joke that stops being funny and becomes the thing it mocked. Outside, the wind crossed the rounded earth of the schoolhouse roof, found no seam to enter, no gap to exploit, no straight road through the packed clay and sod and straw, and continued south across the open plains toward the creek and beyond. The town remembered the blizzard as the night the wind came looking for every crack, and found one house that had already hidden them.